Hello, friends, and welcome to Home is Where the Body Is. I'm Jen, an ADHD woman with EDS, POTS, complex PTSD, and OCD, shaped by an abusive religious upbringing. I spent much of my life feeling like I was balancing precariously over an endless pit, constantly reaching for a stable home that always seemed just out of reach. Today, I can honestly say that home is wherever I am right now, built on the stable ground that's growing out of a deepening relationship with my body and myself. In this podcast, I share the lived experiences that brought me here, in case it helps someone feel less alone or supports them on their own journey home. So today, I want to talk about how I realized that my fault lines, so to speak, were inherited not from monsters, but from normal traumatized people, and that these cracks have been running for generations. And I use, I use fault lines. It's like a metaphor for cracks, I guess. I honestly, it makes me think of the Broken Earth trilogy, which I highly recommend as an excellent representation of generational trauma. But the magic in that universe is all about like manipulating earthquakes and stuff like that. So that's why it makes me think of that. My parents were both very traumatized, I think. Stuff was never really talked about directly, which is its own problem, right? Um, but for instance, for my father, when he was young, I don't know how young, again, don't really have details, but when he was young, his dad left his mom and him and his brother and married my step grandma, um, a if it matters, a much younger woman, which I think it did matter to my grandma. And after he left, um, sorry, trigger warning, I should say, content warning here. I will, in this section, be discussing suicide attempts, domestic abuse, that sort of thing. So, well, really, just those two things. Um, So if you don't want to hear about that, please skip to the next segment of the podcast. So after sorry, I should also mention, by domestic abuse, I mean both physical and sexual abuse. Which I guess sexual is physical, but I think you know what I mean. So after my dad's dad left, um, his mom attempted to kill herself. And again, I'm very fuzzy on the details, but I believe he discovered her and after the attempt, but I also believe that it was pills. Um, so it wasn't overly gory or anything, but I just imagine uh, being a little kid and your dad left and your mom tried to kill herself and just thinking like how little must I matter for both of my parents to just leave, the people who are supposed to love me the most in the world to just leave at a moment's notice. So I feel like that type of insecurity and instability like really is passed down through generations. So I don't want to dwell too much on that, but then just that was just to paint a picture. And then um my mother's background, again, from what I understand, her so she had like 6 siblings. Her mom had like 13 pregnancies, but a bunch of miscarriages. Um, like halfway through having the kids, her mom divorced her real dad and then married her stepdad. And then, so my mom's oldest brother or one of the older brothers would physically beat them up. And um, again, from what I understand, my mom's stepdad would sexually abuse his stepdaughters. I don't know if my mother was one of them, but I do know that one of her sisters was. And just, statistically speaking, I feel like it's reasonable that she experienced it, or at least was in that environment. Um, and of course, a lot of poverty. Um, Her brother died of a drug overdose when he was young. Um, from what I can tell, like all of the women, my mom's sisters, my female cousins, have experienced like some sort of domestic abuse, abusive relationship, or like early pregnancy without, with little support, either, from family or society or that sort of thing, or, from the father and that sort of thing. Um, so yeah, I think the point that I'm trying to make in this section is that it's not just to list a bunch of traumatic experiences, um, but to just reflect that there are never really true starting points when it comes to generational trauma. As always, I link this to a fantasy book. In the Wheel of Time, there are neither beginnings nor endings in the Wheel of Time, but this is a beginning. So I kind of see it like that. Um, I feel like you take any traumatized person and you can trace that trauma back and back and back and back, right? Their parents were traumatized by their parents, were traumatized by their parents, and it just goes on and on and on. And so I think it can be empowering to realize that trauma, these fault lines, are historical and caused and experienced by people, not monsters, right? People. Um, like it's interesting how some people with abusive parents end up kind of hyper defending them, right? That like hyper defensive mindset of like, no, no, my parents have to be great because if they're not great, that means that what I experienced was abuse and I can't handle that. Um, I may not be describing that properly. That wasn't my personal experience. My personal experience was the other side, which is hating, hating them. Like they're so evil. They're monsters. Um, and both of those pathways serve to psychologically protect a child and last often, will last into adulthood. The need to either hate the parents or defend the parents. And again, I am not a psychology professional. I think I took like one psychology class in college. Um, but I have read a lot of books and obviously experienced this myself. So I think what I'm trying to focus on in this episode is that the cause of the trauma is people, not monsters, people, right? Like the people who obsessively defend their abusive parents, they have it just as wrong as I had it. And I had it just as wrong as they have it in terms of like the people who cause the trauma are clearly not perfect angels, but the people who cause the trauma are also not monsters. They're just people who had their own trauma. And that doesn't excuse what they did, but it does explain it. And I think that matters. So, to summarize the last section, in case anyone skipped it because of the content warning, the main point that I was trying to make was that it's, to me, at least, this is all just my personal perspective and experience. To me, the moment that I realized, or it wasn't a single moment, but the transition from recognizing that my parents were not monsters, but were people, and that the things that they experienced did not justify their actions, but did explain their actions. I found that to be helpful to recognize, to realize. And in that, right, I learned that the cruelty wasn't senseless, which to me at least mattered, and in some ways gave me the power to leave it behind. I think, well, for me as an autistic person in particular, I think autistic people are often like, but why? Like, it just, we need to make sense of things, and it can be very distressing when there isn't sense to be made. And in some cases, maybe there is no sense, and it just has to be accepted and moved on. But I think, particularly in the case of generational trauma, right, these fault lines, these cracks that have been running for generations, there is usually a why. And sometimes you may not know it, like specifically what the why is, but I would be curious to anybody listening. Um, what patterns might you have inherited from your own parents? What patterns of trauma and behavior and all of these things? But some of the patterns that I recognized, which it's hard to admit this, but I recognize them in myself as well, um, is anger over lack of control is one of them. So to explain, in the last section I mentioned some of my dad's specific traumas, or what I understand to be his traumas, given that I don't have many details. And I think, given what I given what I explained, it makes sense that he would feel that the people he loves could leave and abandon him at any moment. And so to me, I look at that and I think, no wonder my whole life he raged and broke things. He would fly into these rages and he would break things. And of course, there's a fine line between breaking things and breaking people. So I mean, it is abuse, I think, to break things in front of people. But so I just think, no wonder he did that. For so long, I'd never understood it. And now I think, no wonder he did that. When like, now I recognize, like, it was often triggered by him feeling, or from my perspective, him feeling out of control, him feeling like he didn't have access to the love. Like, it would be triggered by me not being affectionate enough, or, like rejecting his affection, not wanting to spend time with him, that sort of thing. So no wonder he would fly into a rage when he felt that he couldn't control the people he loved. Um, his marriage to my mom, from what I saw, especially in their like divorce proceedings or attempted divorce proceedings, was very much an exercise in control. Like, I don't think he even knows what love really is, partially because I don't think his parents showed him real love in that way. Anyway, again, I don't want to get too sidetracked, but just that pattern recognition. And then seeing in me, I feel like I also can have intense internal rage. Now, I feel like I can't externalize it as much because it's more penalized from a woman. But I do feel like in cases where I feel like it is safe to externalize it, I have done so. Not to the extent of like breaking people or things, but that pattern is in me. And of course, I'm addressing it and have addressed a lot of it, but I think it's helpful to recognize that pattern. And it's hard to recognize that that pattern exists in me, but I also think that that's helpful. And my mother's trauma context as well, right? Abuse, neglect, poverty, all of those things. But what the helpful part is that this cruelty has a reason, um, not randomness. And again, the fact that this cruelty has a reason does not excuse it. And I think that's a key part of this. But in this section, I'm just specifically focusing on how I think it's helpful to recognize, it was helpful to me at least in my trauma healing journey, making home in my own body and nervous system and brain. It was helpful to recognize that. Um, I think that understanding the origin of the trauma patterns, not not the ultimate origin, right? Because that would go back lifetimes and generations, but specifically in my own life, recognizing like where the behaviors of my abusers came from, which was from their own abuse. Um, Understanding the origin, I felt like gave me some agency, like made a shift inside of me where knowing that this harm is intelligible kind of allowed me in a way to break the cycle. And I think here is the key distinction is like the distinction between empathy and obligation. So, what I've been talking about sort of up to this point is empathy for my abusers, essentially. And that is not the same thing as obligation. I think that this sort of empathy, is helpful to me. This sort of empathy of like, I can see why they behaved the way they did, given what I know about them. I can see why. And I can see why I behave, like why I'm prone to certain behaviors and patterns as well. That's helpful. That sort of empathy is helpful. But not obligation. Obligation would be because, or I don't know if obligation is exactly the right word, maybe justification, but it would be because they had reasons for what they did, I'm now obligated to, I don't know, insert thing here, forgive them, have them in my life, excuse their behavior, etc., etc. And I think that is the part that is not helpful because it's not true. Just because you empathize with someone does not mean that you have any sort of obligation to them. I can understand the traumatized child beneath my dad's rage, beneath my mom's, screaming fits, which were probably just meltdowns. I can understand that and still choose to walk away because it's still not my responsibility, because it still caused me harm. And also, to be honest, this has also been helpful in recognizing how I have probably bombed friendships and relationships in the past. How I have probably fucked up. Now, in some cases, yeah, maybe the other person was an asshole. I can certainly think of some cases where I think that was probably true. Or in some cases, it was two people, both being assholes. Traumatized people, I feel like we tend to attract other traumatized people, and it can become quite a mess. Um, but I do think it has been helpful to me to have empathy for my parents, also empathy for myself, and also empathy for the people that I feel like I have harmed in the past. This is just one upward spiral of empathy. But the one thing that it does not include is this obligation thing, or this because they were hurt, they're absolved of all guilt. That is not true. And I think that is something that I don't know if this is just me because I was raised in Christianity, or because I'm a woman and was socialized as a woman, or because I have people pleasing tendencies due to my upbringing. I don't know. But I think that I have internalized this very big message, either from, again, society, my parents, the cult I grew up in. I don't know. But the message is if someone did something because they were hurt, if someone did something because they were stressed out, if someone did something because they had a worse day than you, the harm is excused. And that is absolutely not true. It's impossible for me to feel at home in my body. It's impossible for me to feel calm and at home and at peace with myself if other people can just hurt me and I'm supposed to just excuse it because they had a hard day or because they had a hard childhood. And in the same way, it's impossible for me to feel at home in myself if I excuse myself and my own behaviors because I had a bad childhood. So, another thing I would be curious about is to anybody listening, if you do have inherited patterns, does understanding their origins give you the power to choose differently? I think for me, the answer is it certainly has helped. But I think to summarize what I'm getting at here, as my empathy expanded, I feel like my tolerance shrank. My tolerance of harm, bullshit, excuses, bad apologies, unhealthy patterns, unhealthy people in my life, etc., if that makes sense. Not not tolerance of healthy differences. So like seeing the humanity behind the trauma built empathy, right? What must that have felt like for my dad when his dad abandoned him and then his mom tried to abandon him and he was just a little kid, right? What must it have felt like for my mom growing up with poverty, with drug addiction, not her herself, but her family, and domestic abuse and loss and grief and all of these things. And that builds empathy. But then recognizing the pattern also allows discernment. For me, it allowed me to say, like, what must that have felt like? Wow, no wonder they behaved the way they did. And now I see the pattern and I can choose who stays in my life. And for me, I chose they would not be in my life. And that still, to this day, remains one of the best decisions I have ever made. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure if I fully recognized this pattern, this generational trauma, if I saw them as anything other than monsters before I cut them out of my life. But I do think that so it may have been a delayed recognition and processing on my part, but I don't think healing has to be in some sort of linear format. I guess what I'm saying is like don't feel like nobody should feel like they have to come to this grand empathy awakening recognition of patterns and generational trauma before they kick someone unhealthy out of their life. No. go ahead and kick the unhealthy person out of your life, is what I think, anyway. But I do think that coming to this realizations kind of helps, and for me, made me feel secure in the decision that I made. I think sometimes we make these decisions on instinct, and then later really process and understand why that was the right decision for us. And I think that that processing is helpful and shouldn't be skipped, even if it happens afterwards. Um, so I think the key here is that boundaries, boundaries are so important for me in terms of feeling at home in my own space, in my own body. And I truly think that empathy helps with boundaries. Recognizing these patterns helps with boundaries. For me, it's something about just like seeing the bigger picture that allows me to recognize where one person ends and I begin. Because that's what boundaries are. They're just the delineations between different people. And so having this empathy of like, this isn't even just about my parents. Like, I had this weird interaction with my neighbor that I might um, use to illustrate, but having this empathy for like, this is why someone behaves like this. Like, sometimes I'll see people at the pharmacy or whatever just absolutely raging at the pharmacist, and I'm like, wow, that is rude and horrible. But then there's also a part of me that's like, I understand their complaints too. Like, it seems like they're on Medicaid and they can't get approvals for this and that, and I'm like, I get that. I've been there, and both are true. So, the point is that I think that boundaries become easier. The boundary of being like, for instance, if I was the one getting screamed at by that person or whatever, being like, yeah, I can empathize. I can understand where they're coming from. And boundary. It's not my responsibility to absorb their hurt and their pain. And that's how it is with my parents, right? It's not my responsibility. Their hurt and their pain was never supposed to be mine to deal with. And so now I reject it. My boundary is to kick that out of my space and put it firmly back in their space where it belongs. Boundaries and internal stability, for me, have become a central pillar of home, of my internal home inside myself. They're the walls to that house, the walls that hold it up and that keep the bad things out. Home, in that way, becomes portable. I take it with me. I take my boundaries with me wherever I go, in whatever situation I'm in, and self generated. And this is the key, not dependent on others' behaviors, right? Because if if other people's pain and trauma is your responsibility, then your home is going to come crashing down anytime someone starts being mean to you or offloading their pain onto you or anything of that nature because you'll just let it in. And of course, that's what we did as kids. That's what we had to do to survive. We didn't know any better. There is, of course, no shame or judgment. If that is your natural mode of operation, it is certainly my natural mode of operation. But that's the whole key, I guess, in this episode is that recognizing that other people have valid reasons for why they behave the way they did, even if it's abusive to us, and boundary that's still harmful to me, and I'm not going to allow it. And that is what makes my home, my internal sense of home, not dependent on the behavior of others, but only dependent on my own boundaries. And it's a paradox that empathy can coexist with this sort of selective tolerance, allowing a safe, flexible sense of belonging, no longer caught up in whether the other person's suffering was enough to justify them causing me to suffer. And I think that is sort of the key for me is, as I mentioned before, I feel like I have always existed with this concept of like, if the other person suffered enough, then them lashing out at me is justified. And I think a lot of people apologize in that way. I don't know what it is with society and terrible apologies. Maybe it's because we're all traumatized and emotionally immature and we're all trained to apologize in this way because this is how our parents apologize to us or whatever. But I feel like there are a lot of apologies that are like, I'm sorry, I was having a bad day. Or like, oh, well, I'm sorry, but like, you don't know how bad I had it. I feel like my mom said that to me a lot. And that's bullshit. It's not, your own suffering is not an excuse to offload that suffering onto other people. I'm done with that calculation. I am no longer engaging in this calculation of whether the other person's suffering was enough to justify them causing me to suffer, them causing me pain. I am done with that. Because those two are not related. Their pain is real, and my pain is real. And I get to put up a boundary against that pain. As we come to the end of this episode, I want to thank you for spending this time with me. If anything in this episode resonated with you and you'd like to share a thought, reflection, or bit of feedback, you're very welcome to email me. And if this podcast feels supportive or meaningful to you, I'd appreciate it if you left an honest review or shared it with someone who might also find it helpful. That's how this work finds the people that it's meant for. You've been listening to Home is Where the Body Is. I'm Jen, and I wish you a safe journey home.